The day I walked into that probate courtroom, I was shaking so hard I had to press my hands against my thighs just to keep still. Ray was at the front table, sitting like he owned the room, which, I guess, he thought he did. His attorney had a leather portfolio open in front of him, and inside that portfolio was a will, a document that supposedly proved everything in my father's estate belonged to my mother, to Ray. My mother was sitting right beside him, dabbing her eyes with a tissue. I remember thinking, she actually believes him. I slid into a seat near the back and kept my bag on my lap. Inside that bag was an envelope, white, legal-sized, sealed with tape that had gone yellow at the edges from years sitting in a shoebox. My father's handwriting was on the front. 4 words, written in blue pen. For my daughter, always. I had carried that envelope around for 6 weeks without opening it. My father had given it to me 16 years earlier and told me, in the quiet, serious way he had, that I should only open it if something happened to him. I never thought I'd have to. But Ray thought he had already destroyed everything. He was at the front of that room, completely confident, completely sure of himself. He had no idea I was sitting behind him. And he had absolutely no idea what was in my bag. If you're new here, hit subscribe and stay with me, because this story took over a year of my life, and I promise you every single detail matters. Let me back up. I grew up in a mid-sized town in the Midwest. The kind of place where everyone knows your family's name and your family's business, whether they want to or not. My parents divorced when I was 12. I want to be clear about something. It wasn't ugly. There was no screaming, no dramatic blow-up I can point to. My mom and dad just stopped working as a couple. They were different people. My dad was quiet and patient and methodical. My mom was louder, more social, always needing to be somewhere, doing something. After the divorce, my dad got the house. It was the old farmhouse his own father had built, sitting on about 9 acres of land just outside of town. He kept his landscaping business running out of that property, a small company he'd built over 20 years, mostly residential contracts, a few commercial accounts. My mom moved into a smaller place in town. Within a few years, she found Ray. Raymond C. Holt. I need to tell you who Ray was, because the easy version of this story is that Ray was a monster from day one. But that would be a lie, and if I'm going to tell you this story, I'm going to tell you all of it. Ray was charming, genuinely charming. He remembered the names of waiters at restaurants. He laughed at his own jokes in a self-deprecating way that made you laugh too. He worked in commercial real estate. Not rich exactly, but comfortable. He drove a clean truck and wore decent boots, which in our town meant something. He and my mom dated for about 3 years before they got married. I was in college by then, and honestly, I didn't hate him. He wasn't trying to replace my dad. He didn't try to be my father figure or overstep. He just existed in my mom's life, and I existed in mine. My dad, for his part, never said a negative word about Ray. Not once. That was just who my dad was. He had a way of keeping his thoughts to himself, especially the ones that would have started a fight. He'd just kind of nod and say, "That's fine." Looking back now, I wonder how much he actually kept to himself. I graduated college, got a job in graphic design, and moved into an apartment about 40 minutes from my hometown. I visited my dad every few weeks. He was always the same, working in the yard, coffee on the porch, asking about my life without ever prying. There was one thing I want you to know about my dad. He loved that land. The 9 acres had been in his family for 3 generations. He knew every tree on it. He'd walk the fence line in the evening like it was a ritual. He talked about maybe building a small guest house out near the back tree line someday. He never did, but the intention was always there, this quiet love for the place. I didn't know what that land was actually worth. None of us did. Or so I thought. My dad was diagnosed with non-Hodgkin's lymphoma in March, about 2.5 years ago. He told me on a Sunday afternoon. I had driven out to see him, and when I got there he was sitting at the kitchen table with 2 cups of coffee already poured, which was unlike him. He usually waited until I was through the door to start the coffee. That should have told me something. He said it plainly. No preamble, no softening. Got some news from the doctor. Got lymphoma. We're going to figure it out. I sat down. I don't remember what I said. I remember the coffee going cold in front of me. What followed was about 18 months of treatment, chemotherapy, remission, a brief stretch where we thought we were through it, and then a recurrence that moved faster than anyone expected. He went from being my dad who walked fence lines at dusk to being someone who needed help getting to the bathroom, and it happened in about 6 weeks. It was brutal. If you've watched a parent go through that, I don't need to describe it. What I do want to tell you about is something that happened in those last few weeks. He was still mostly lucid. still himself in the ways that counted. One afternoon I was sitting with him in his bedroom, where they'd set up a hospital bed, and he looked at me for a long moment and said, "You still have that envelope I gave you?" I had completely forgotten about it. I must have been about 16 when he gave it to me. We'd been sitting at the kitchen table after dinner, and he set a sealed white envelope in front of me and said, "I want you to hold on to this. Don't open it unless something happens to me." I'd put it in a keepsake box, one of those cardboard boxes where teenagers stuff ticket stubs and birthday cards and whatever else feels important at 16. When I moved out, that box came with me and ended up in the closet of my old bedroom at my mom's house, where I'd never gone back for it. I told my dad yes, I still had it. I didn't want to tell him I'd basically forgotten its existence. He nodded. Just once, slowly. "Good," he said. "That's good." And then he said something that I have turned over in my mind 1,000 times since. "Ray's been around a lot lately." I looked at him. "Yeah?" He didn't say anything else. I almost pushed. I almost asked what he meant, but he closed his eyes and seemed to be drifting off, and I let the moment pass. That was the beginning of everything. I just didn't know it yet. My dad passed away on a Tuesday, about 3 weeks after that conversation. My mom called me, and Ray drove her out to the house because she said she was too upset to drive. I got there as fast as I could. Ray was in the kitchen when I arrived. He looked up and gave me a sad, sympathetic look. "I'm so sorry," he said. "Your dad was a good man." I thanked him. I was too gutted to think about anything else. But I remember noticing, even then, that the second drawer in the kitchen, the one my dad always kept his important papers in, was slightly open. I noticed it, and then I let it go, the way you let things go when you're too deep in grief to add anything new. I really wish I hadn't let it go. The weeks after my dad died were chaotic in the specific way that losing a parent always is. A blur of arrangements and phone calls and casseroles from neighbors and thank you notes to write. My aunt flew in from out of state. My dad's business partner, a quiet man named Keith, came to the funeral and couldn't look anyone in the eye without tearing up. About 2 weeks after the funeral, I asked my mom about the will. I expected her to say something like, "Ray's handling it," which was more or less true about every practical matter in their household. What I didn't expect was the specific way she said it. She looked slightly away from me and said, "There doesn't seem to have been a will." I blinked. "What do you mean?" Ray went through the house thoroughly. There wasn't one. I thought about the drawer. The second drawer, slightly open when I'd walked in that first night. "Dad had a will," I said. "He told me years ago." "Well," my mom said, "Ray looked everywhere. There was nothing." I called the attorney who had handled my dad's affairs. I knew his name because my dad had mentioned him over the years. He confirmed that, yes, years ago he had helped my father draft a will. But he said my dad had gone elsewhere for an update a few years back. He assumed the new will existed somewhere, but he no longer had a copy. The newer attorney, he said, had since retired and their firm had dissolved. My stomach did something uncomfortable when he told me that. Because here's the thing, when someone dies without a will, the estate goes through what's called intestate succession, which basically means the state decides who inherits what. For my dad, who had never remarried, that meant his estate would flow to his only living child. To me. So if there was no will, shouldn't I have been the one Ray was calling about the property? I wasn't hearing from anyone. Just silence. Ray called me about 2 weeks later. His voice was calm, warm even. He said that actually, they had found a will after all. He apologized for the confusion, said it had been in a folder in the back office of my dad's business, and they'd only just gone through everything. I asked him to send me a copy. He said he would. He didn't. Something in the back of my mind started paying very close attention. 3 weeks went by. I called my mom. She said the will was being handled by Ray's attorney, and that she didn't want to discuss it over the phone. She sounded rehearsed, like she was reading from something someone had written for her. When I finally got a copy, not from Ray, but from the probate court where my dad's estate had been filed, I sat in my car in the parking lot and read it twice. My father's name was on it, his address, the date, it was dated 18 months before he died. And the entire estate, the house, the land, the business, was left to Karen Holt, my mother's married name. I read it again. Then I put it down on the passenger seat and stared at the windshield for a long time. My father would never have done that. I want to be careful here, because I know how that sounds. Children always think their parents wouldn't do this thing or that thing, and sometimes they're wrong. So let me explain what I mean. My father left my mother. Civilly, without bitterness, but he left. In the years after the divorce, they were politely distant. Not enemies, but not friends. He'd never once said her name to me in a way that suggested anything lingering, and in 18 months of illness, when he'd had every reason to reflect on his life and his relationships, he had never mentioned leaving anything to my mother. He had asked me if I still had the envelope. He had said, "Ray's been around a lot lately," and now there was a will leaving my father's entire estate, including 9 acres of land outside of town, to the wife of a commercial real estate developer. I went home that night and couldn't sleep. I sat on my couch with the copy of the will in my hands, reading it over and over, looking for something I was missing. And then I remembered something small, specific, the kind of thing you wouldn't notice unless you'd watched someone sign things your whole life. My dad's signature had a very particular characteristic. He'd broken his right index finger as a teenager, and it healed slightly crooked, and because of the way that affected how he held a pen, the capital T in Thomas had a loop that curved back and upward, in a very specific way. I had watched him sign checks, Christmas cards, report cards, permission slips for my entire childhood. I looked at the signature on that will. The loop went down and to the left. It was close. It was very, very close. But it wasn't right. I sat with that for a week before I let myself say out loud what I was already thinking. Someone had forged my father's will. I went to my mom's house on a Saturday, about 6 weeks after my dad passed. I told her I wanted to pick up some of my old things, completely true, nothing suspicious about it. She was out running errands, and Ray was at what he called a property meeting that always seemed to happen on weekends. I went to my old bedroom. The closet was the same as I'd left it years ago. Winter coats in the front, a few boxes on the upper shelf. I stood on a step stool and felt around until my hand closed around a cardboard box with a lid. Inside, a birthday card from 8th grade, a movie ticket stub, a friendship bracelet, and underneath all of it, at the very bottom, a white envelope, slightly yellowed at the edges, sealed with tape. My father's handwriting on the front. For my daughter, always. I didn't open it there. I put the box back, tucked the envelope into my jacket, and left before my mom got home. I sat in my car around the corner and I opened it. Inside was a document, multi-page, printed on legal paper. The last will and testament of Thomas Allen Mercer. Dated 14 months before his death. I read every line. Everything. The house, the 9 acres, the landscaping business, his savings account, his truck. Left entirely and specifically to me. There was even a personal note at the end, just 2 paragraphs, in his voice exactly, saying that the land had been in his family for 3 generations, and he wanted it to stay that way. He said he trusted me to make good decisions. He'd signed it. The loop on the T curved up and back, exactly the way I remembered. Below his signature, a notary stamp and a witness signature. I sat in that car for a very long time. When I finally drove home, the first thing I did was look up my dad's property address online. That's when I found out about Clearwater Development Group. I don't know how I'd missed it. Maybe because I hadn't been looking. The county had approved a large commercial development project, a mixed-use retail and residential complex, slated to be built on land that bordered exactly the area where my dad's property sat. There had been news articles about it for over a year. The development needed access road easements, and several of the parcels they were looking to acquire sat right next to or adjacent to my father's 9 acres. I searched the name Clearwater Development Group. 3 board members were listed on their corporate filing documents, publicly available. One of them was Raymond C. Holt. I had to read it 3 times. Ray wasn't just my stepfather managing an estate during a hard time. Ray was one of the principals of the company that needed my father's land. I thought about everything I knew. The timeline, the discovered will that hadn't existed before, the open drawer on the night of my father's death, my father's quiet warning about Ray being around, the forged signature. He hadn't waited for my father to die to start planning. He had been inside that house before anyone else arrived. He'd destroyed the real will. And then, he'd produced a forged document transferring everything to my mother, because through their marriage, he'd have effective control over whatever she inherited. 9 acres of land he needed for a development deal worth multiple millions of dollars. I thought about my dad in that hospital bed, asking me if I still had the envelope. He knew. He didn't know exactly how far Ray would go, but he knew something was wrong. And he was making sure I had the truth before he couldn't protect it anymore. My hands wouldn't stop shaking. I made a mistake then. I want to be honest about this. About 4 days after finding the real will and researching Clearwater, I called my mom. I wasn't planning to confront anyone. I just needed to hear her voice. I needed to know if she had any idea what was happening. I didn't tell her about the envelope. I didn't tell her what I'd found, I just asked her, carefully, whether she knew Ray had business connections to a development company interested in my dad's land. There was a pause, then she said, "I don't know what you're talking about." I said, "Mom, I'm just asking. Does the name Clearwater Development Group mean anything to you?" Another pause, longer. She said, "You need to stop digging into things that aren't your business." That sentence went through me like ice water, my own mother. And then she said, "Ray told me you might do this." She hung up. I sat in my apartment that night, thinking about what "Ray told me you might do this" actually meant. It meant Ray had already been preparing her, already building a version of events where I was the problem, the difficult daughter who couldn't let go, who was stirring up trouble during a family's hard time. And if he had already gotten to my mother, what else had he done? 2 days later, I was at the grocery store and ran into a woman from my hometown who knew both of my parents. She stopped to offer her condolences, and then said something odd. She said, "I heard you've been giving your mom a hard time about the estate." I asked where she'd heard that. She looked uncomfortable. "Oh, you know, people talk." Ray was already managing the narrative. In a town where everyone knew everyone, he was laying groundwork. If I challenged the will, I would be the grieving daughter who couldn't accept her father's wishes. Emotional, irrational, difficult. He had thought of everything. Except for a conversation between a father and his 16-year-old daughter in a kitchen after dinner. An envelope tucked into a shoebox, a box in a closet nobody had touched in years. He hadn't thought of that. There was one person I trusted enough to tell what I knew, and I needed to find them fast. His name was Daniel Webb. He wasn't a private investigator or a detective. He was a probate attorney, the best one in our county, according to the 2 people I called before I landed on him. He had a small office above a dry cleaning shop downtown, which wasn't impressive, but his reputation was. I made an appointment for a Thursday afternoon. I walked in with the original will in a manila envelope, a printed copy of the forged will from the probate court, and my laptop open to the Clearwater Development Group corporate filing. Daniel was in his late 50s, with reading glasses he wore down on his nose like a professor. He listened to everything I said without interrupting me once. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "How long have you had this?" "About 3 weeks." He nodded, slowly. He put on his glasses and spread both documents on the desk in front of him, side by side. He looked at them for a long time. "The notary stamp on this one," he said, touching the forged will, "is for a firm I recognize. If I can establish when they shut down relative to this date, and if this stamp was used after they closed, that's a significant problem for whoever produced this document." I hadn't even noticed that. "And this one," he said, touching my father's real will, "appears to be properly executed. We'll need a forensic examiner to authenticate the signature, but assuming it's genuine, you are the sole beneficiary of your father's estate." He set his glasses down and looked at me. "Are you prepared for what you're about to do?" I said yes. He said, "This will get ugly. The man you're describing has resources and influence in this community. He's going to fight this. He's going to make it personal." He paused. "And there's something else you should know." He turned his laptop around. He'd pulled up a property assessment, my dad's land. 9 acres bordering the Clearwater Development Corridor, he said. Current assessed value, $400,000. Estimated fair market value given the commercial development. He paused just long enough to let me feel the weight of what was coming. $2.3 million. I didn't say anything for a moment. "Mr. Holt isn't just a stepfather who mishandled a grief-stricken family's estate," Daniel said. "He positioned himself, through your mother, to take control of a $2.3 million asset that he needed for a commercial project he stands to profit enormously from." I thought about Ray at the kitchen table in my dad's house, the night my dad died, offering his condolences, looking appropriately sad, already knowing what was in that second drawer. "What do we do?" I said. Daniel pulled out a notepad. "First," he said, "we document everything, quietly. We get forensic analysis done on both documents. We verify the notary stamp timeline. We compile every piece of public record linking Mr. Holt to Clearwater and establishing financial motive. And we do all of this before anyone knows you have that will." Ray already knows I've been asking questions. "There's a difference," Daniel said, "between asking questions and having the original document in your possession." He looked at me evenly. He doesn't know about the envelope. If he did, he would have come for it already. He was right. Ray had been methodical. But he hadn't accounted for a conversation that happened 16 years ago in a kitchen after dinner. He hadn't known about a shoebox in a closet that nobody had touched. The things that save us are sometimes the most ordinary things in the world. We spent the next 3 weeks building the case. The forensic document examiner, a woman named Rita who had testified in court cases across 4 states, spent 48 hours with both wills. Her findings were definitive. The paper used for the forged will had been manufactured no earlier than 11 months before it was supposedly signed, which was impossible given its stated date of 18 months prior. The toner from the printing was consistent with a home laser printer, not the type used by professional estate attorneys. And the signature, Rita confirmed what I had already noticed. The specific motor characteristics of my father's genuine signature, the way his old finger injury affected his pen grip, were absent from the forged document. She could state that with scientific certainty. Meanwhile, Daniel's assistant pulled every public record on Clearwater Development Group, the county development approvals, and Ray's corporate role. We built a timeline showing Ray had known about the development corridor for at least 3 years, which meant he had been sitting at holiday dinners and summer cookouts at my dad's house for years, knowing exactly what that land was worth. Then we found something else. A deed transaction, a real estate transfer filed quietly in county records about 2 weeks after my father died. My mother had signed over power of attorney to Ray for purposes of managing the estate during the probate process. She thought she was just being helpful during a hard time. She had no idea what she'd handed him. I remember the afternoon Daniel called me with that information. I was driving home from work and had to pull over. I sat on the side of the road and thought about my mother. Not the mother who'd said, "Stop digging into things that aren't your business." The mother who'd driven 4 hours to bring me soup when I was sick in college. The mother who danced in the kitchen when she thought nobody was watching. She wasn't complicit. She was being used. That made everything harder and also, somehow, easier at the same time. Harder because I was fighting someone standing right next to the person I needed to protect. Easier because that person wasn't my enemy. Then there was the setback. About 2 weeks into our preparation, someone broke into my apartment. Nothing was taken. My laptop was there, my wallet. Everything was in place, but slightly wrong. A drawer I always closed fully was open an inch. A folder on my desk that I knew I'd left face down was face up. I started calling Daniel from a coffee shop instead of from my apartment. I moved the original will and the entire envelope into a safety deposit box at a bank in a town 20 miles away. And I started to understand something. This was not just about money. It never had been. This was about a man who had been calculating, patient, and ruthless, and who had come very close to getting away with it. The hearing was scheduled for 6 weeks out. In the weeks leading up to the hearing, Ray turned up the pressure in ways I hadn't anticipated. His attorney sent a letter to Daniel's office, suggesting I had stolen personal documents from my mother's home, and that they were prepared to address that matter legally if necessary. My mother's home, the house where I grew up, the closet that held my own belongings from my own childhood. I asked Daniel if that was a real threat. He said, "It's intimidation. They're trying to make you hesitate." He paused. "It means they're nervous." Ray also called me once, about 3 weeks before the hearing. I almost didn't pick up, but I did. He was calm, almost gentle. He said he understood this was a hard time and that grief made people do things they wouldn't normally do. He said he didn't want to be at odds with me. He said my mother was torn apart by the conflict and that he hoped we could find a way through this as a family. It was a masterclass in manipulation. He sounded so reasonable, so caring. If I hadn't already known what I knew, I might have second-guessed myself. I had my phone set to record. I'd started recording every call with him after Daniel advised me to. I said, "Ray, did you go through my father's things before anyone else got to the house?" A brief pause, just a beat. Then, "I was trying to help. Karen was devastated. Someone had to handle things." "Including the paperwork?" I went through the office, yes. I was trying to organize things for the attorney. "Did you find a will?" "We talked about this. We found one eventually, in the business files, like I said." "That's the only one you found?" Another pause, slightly longer this time. "That's the only one there was." I said okay, thanked him for calling, and hung up. Daniel listened to the recording that afternoon and made a copy. "He's careful," he said. "He doesn't say anything explicit, but the pauses." He tapped his notepad. A judge notices pauses. We were almost ready. The night before the hearing, I drove out to my dad's property. I don't know exactly why. It wasn't mine yet, not legally, not officially. The lights were off. The yard was the same old maple in the front that my dad had strung lights on every Christmas, the same gravel path from the gate to the front door. 9 acres that had been in my family for 3 generations. My great-grandfather had broken his back building this place. My grandfather had planted the back tree line. My dad had walked the fence every evening, because that was his way of saying he was still here, still watching over it. I stood at that fence for a long time. Then I went home and got maybe 4 hours of sleep. At 8 o'clock the next morning, I walked into the probate court with Daniel beside me and the original will in a manila envelope, and I took a seat near the back of the room. Ray was already at the front table. He didn't see me come in. Ray's attorney presented the forged will with complete confidence. He talked about my father's long-standing desire to provide for his ex-wife, about the will being properly executed and filed in accordance with the law. He cited the notary stamp, he cited the date. He was very good at his job. If I hadn't known what I knew, I might have believed him. Daniel let him finish. Then Daniel stood and said he had several items to submit to the court, and he set 3 documents on the judge's desk. The first was Rita's forensic analysis of the forged will, concluding that the paper, toner, and signature were inconsistent with the document's claimed date of execution. The second was a letter from the State Notary Licensing Board confirming that the notary firm whose stamp appeared on the forged will had surrendered its license 11 months before the will's stated date. The stamp had been used after the firm no longer legally existed. The third was the original will, authenticated by Rita's analysis, dated and properly executed, with a valid notary stamp, leaving the entire estate to me. The room was very quiet. Ray's attorney immediately moved to challenge the authenticity of the original will. He started speaking quickly: chain of custody, provenance of the document, where this had come from, and why it was only appearing now. Daniel calmly explained that the document had been in my possession since my father handed it to me personally 16 years prior, and that I had a witness, a woman who had been visiting our home the day my father gave it to me, and had seen him hand me the envelope, though not its contents. Ray had been sitting very still. I watched his hands. They were flat on the table. Then, slowly, they curled. The judge asked Ray's attorney for a direct response to the forensic findings. Ray's attorney said he needed time to review the analysis. The judge looked at Ray directly, not at the attorney, at Ray, and said, "Mr. Holt, are you aware of the findings regarding the notary stamp?" Ray said, "That's a matter for the attorneys too." The judge said, "I'm asking you directly." Ray looked at me for the first time. I hadn't moved. I was sitting near the back with my hands folded, and I just looked at him. His face changed. I can't fully describe it. It was like watching something behind his eyes click over into a different gear. Not guilt exactly, but calculation. He was running scenarios in real time. He said, very quietly, "I just wanted to make sure Karen was protected." His attorney put a hand on his arm immediately, but the judge had already heard it. I don't want to over-dramatize that moment because courtrooms aren't television. There was no gasp, no dramatic gavel slam. The judge simply wrote something down and asked both attorneys to approach the bench. But what Ray had just said, "I just wanted to make sure Karen was protected," was an acknowledgement. It wasn't a full confession, but it was enough to establish that he had taken an active personal role in shaping the outcome of my father's estate. Paired with the forensic evidence Daniel had spent 6 weeks carefully building, it was enough. The forged will was invalidated. The estate was remanded back to proper probate proceedings under the authenticated original will. Ray's attorney filed challenges over the following weeks: motions, authenticity arguments, procedural objections, but every single one ran directly into the forensic record that couldn't be argued away. None of it held. And then the thing happened that I didn't expect. As the hearing broke up and people were gathering their things, my mother looked at me from across the room. She hadn't spoken to me in weeks. She looked pale and confused and older than I'd remembered. Ray had his hand on her arm, steering her toward the exit. She looked over her shoulder at me. Ray kept moving. My mother stopped. Ray said her name. She said, "I need a minute." He said her name again, more firmly. She shook her arm free and took 2 steps toward me. She said, "Did he?" And she stopped. She looked back at Ray, who was watching her with that same calm, reasonable expression he'd used on the phone with me. "Did he do all of this?" I said, "Yes." She covered her mouth with her hand. Ray walked out of the courtroom alone. My mother stood there in the middle of that room, and I watched her understand something I think some part of her had known for a while and hadn't allowed herself to face. The decisions she'd been asked to make, the things she'd been told about me, the version of events she'd been living inside. I didn't say anything else. I just walked over and stood next to her. She started crying, not quietly, the kind that comes from somewhere deep and has been held back too long. I put my arm around her. "If you've been watching this whole story and thinking about what you would have done differently, I genuinely want to know. Drop it in the comments below. There are so many moments I've replayed in my head wondering if I made the right call, and I'd love to hear how you see it. The probate court's invalidation of the forged will triggered a referral to the district attorney's office for criminal investigation. These things don't move quickly. I want to be honest with you about that. Months passed before charges were formally filed. Ray was charged with will forgery, fraud upon the court, and fraudulent conveyance in connection with the power of attorney my mother had unknowingly signed over to him. His attorney was skilled, and Ray had resources, and the case worked through the system for the better part of a year. In the end, Ray pleaded guilty to will forgery and fraud on the court. He received a 2-year suspended sentence, a significant fine, and was required to surrender all claims connected to my father's estate and repay the full cost of the probate proceedings. I know that might not feel like enough. There were days it didn't feel like enough to me. He had spent years planning this. He had walked into my father's house on the night of his death and destroyed a document my father had spent his last weeks making sure was protected. But here is what actually happened as a result. The Clearwater development deal collapsed. Without my father's land, the access corridor their project required didn't work the way they'd designed it, and the whole proposal had to be restructured. Ray's 2 partners pushed him out of the board entirely. He lost his primary source of income and the significant personal investment he'd made in the project. And he lost my mother. She filed for divorce about 4 months after the hearing. It didn't happen overnight. There was a period where I could see her weighing things, looking for a version of the story where she could keep her life intact and still be at peace with herself. I didn't push. I just showed up when she asked and gave her space when she needed it. The divorce was finalized 8 months later. Ray moved to another state. I don't know where, and I genuinely don't need to. The estate was settled in my name about 14 months after the hearing. The house, the land, the landscaping business, which Keith had been holding together out of loyalty and sheer stubbornness for almost 2 years by that point. Daniel made the call when it was done. He said, "It's yours, officially and entirely." I sat in my car in a grocery store parking lot and called my dad's cell number, the one I hadn't yet canceled. It just rang. I knew it would. I just needed to do it. It's been about 18 months since that hearing. I moved into my father's house about a year ago. It felt strange at first. Not sad exactly, but weighted. Like every room still held a version of him that I had to learn to move around. I kept the landscaping business going. Keith is still there, and we worked out an arrangement that makes sense for both of us. It's not a huge operation, but it was my dad's life's work, and I wasn't going to be the one who let it go. The land is still the land. I've had 3 different developers approach me in the last year. I've said no to all of them. I don't have a grand plan for those 9 acres. No design, no timeline, no development vision. I just know that my great-grandfather built something here. My grandfather planted the back tree line. My dad walked the fence at dusk because that was his way of telling himself he was home. I'm still figuring out what I'm supposed to add to that story. Maybe just this, that it stayed. My relationship with my mom is complicated is the honest word for it. We're talking again. We have dinner sometimes. There are conversations we've started that neither of us has been able to finish yet, and I think we're both okay with that for now. She made mistakes. She trusted the wrong person. She said things to me during that year that I haven't fully let go of. But she shook her arm free and took 2 steps toward me in a courtroom. And that matters more than I know how to say. I think about my dad a lot, especially in the evenings when I walk the fence line the same way he used to. I asked him once, during one of those last hospital conversations, why he'd given me that envelope instead of leaving it with an attorney or filing it somewhere official. He thought about it for a second and then said, "Because I trust you to not lose it." He said it like it was the simplest thing in the world, like trust was just a plain fact, not a complicated weight to carry. I think about that every time I walk the back fence, past the tree line, past the place where the ground dips slightly and fills with mist on cool mornings in the fall. He trusted me to not lose it. I didn't. There were moments during all of this where I thought about just letting it go. The whole thing felt so much bigger than me. The legal system, the money, Ray's resources, my mother's anger, the way the whole town seemed to already have a version of the story that cast me as the problem. There were nights where accepting that I'd been robbed felt easier than fighting. And then I'd think about my dad asking me, from a hospital bed, if I still had the envelope. He wasn't asking about paper. He was asking if I still had the truth. If I was still holding on to it. I was, and I'm glad. Thank you so much for watching this all the way through. Genuinely, this story was one of the hardest things I've ever tried to put into words, and the fact that you stayed with it means everything to me. if it hit you in any way, if it made you think about your own family, about trust, about the things people do when they believe no one is watching. Leave a comment below. I read every single one, and I'd love to hear what this brought up for you. If you haven't subscribed yet, please do. I share stories like this regularly. Real ones, human ones, the kind that remind us that the truth has a way of surviving, even when people do everything in their power to bury it. I'll see you in the next one.